Let's move on from this and speak to Christopher Pickard. Now, Christopher was the ghostwriter of the Ronnie Biggs book, The Great Train Robber, who escaped Wandsworth Prison in 1965. Not just writer Christopher, but also a big friend of Ronnie Biggs, as I understand it, even speaking at his funeral. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ian. How are you?
Good as gold at this end.
Yeah, no, I knew Ron very well. We both lived in Rio at the same time. And I got to know him, obviously. And
you were meant to be there. He wasn't, I'm assuming.
Yeah, just about that. But, you know, the Brazilians took the attitude he never committed a crime in Brazil other than entering the country illegally on the wrong passport. So that's why they didn't send him back.
Of course. He was on the run for, what, 36 years?
Yeah, I was interested to hear the Justice Minister's comments. I'm sure back in '65, a Justice Secretary said exactly the same thing, that we'll have Biggs back inside. 13,000 days later, Ron returned under his own steam.
Yeah. What? Just remind us, before we come back to the actual escape, I mean, what he died in, what, 2012, 2013?
2013, 10 years ago. Yes, it was during the 50th anniversary of the robbery, yeah.
So he went, he came back to the UK and went straight to jail, is that right?
Yeah, they took him straight to Belmarsh, where he then spent most of the rest of the time until his release. And that was slightly crazy because a lot of people pass through Belmarsh as a sort of a holding place before they send them to other prisons. But he spent most of his time there, and they always used to give me the argument, oh, it's got the best medical service of any of the prisons, and that's what he needs. And I used to say, well, if that's the best you've got, God help anybody else in the prison system that's ill, because it was pretty appalling. Because obviously, I mean, let's be fair, if you are a doctor, you don't probably volunteer that the place you work is a prison. So they didn't have the best. So that's why they always had to take Ron out to hospital, and he'd be chained to God knows how many policemen when he went out.
It's interesting, isn't it? Was that because they thought somebody else might step in and, you know, there could be an arranged cartel of characters ready to stick him in the back of a van and drive off? Or because, you know, Ron himself at that stage, I wouldn't imagine was much of a threat.
No, but you've got it absolutely right. In fact, when Ron went into Belmarsh, he got the word there were certain people that wanted to break him out of Belmarsh just to give another two fingers up to the establishment. Right. And Ron had to say, I haven't come all the way back in a wheelchair from Rio to go on the run in a wheelchair. And he had to say, thank you very much. It's very nice of you.
Yes. Thank you for your services.
Thank you.
I don't require them.
Yeah, I mean, but to give you an idea of how paranoid they were about Ron, he was always in the medical wing there, and they would put the most risk people. So one of his neighbours at one stage was Jeffrey Archer. Because obviously they realised when Jeffrey Archer went through there, if Jeffrey Archer was in the normal prison population, somebody might do harm to him.
Sure.
So the first time was probably Ron was the only person that Jeffrey Archer would have recognised.
I wasn't aware that Archer was in Belmarsh. I mean, I remember...
Yes, you should get him on for his prison recollection.
Well, I did. I read his diaries at the time. I remember he released those diaries, and they were a little bit worthy. They weren't great, but there was some insight into it. But I'd totally forgotten that Archer was in of all prisons. You'd have thought he'd been put into some open prison on gardening duty or something.
But he was moved. I mean, that was the norm. You see, if you're a high-profile person, you get put in Belmarsh for a week or so. And Ron had fun with him because he deliberately pretended he didn't know who Archer was when Archer came up to say hello to him, and Ron had, his voice. So then he tapped up, of course, I know who you are. But when you're asking what goes on in prisons, and it relates to Jeffrey Archer, at one stage, Mike Biggs, Ron's son, got a call from the Daily Mail saying, look, we need to meet you because we've got a photo of your father in his bed, in his cell in Belmarsh. And they had to get Mike's permission by, the regulations to publish it because it was family. What we worked out was the person who took it had to be a guard. No other prisoner would have been near Ron with a camera. No visitor would have been. So it was a guard did it. And we believe that someone had paid somebody to get a photo of Archer in Belmarsh. And he wasn't there. The guy panicked. He saw Ron's prison door was open, cell door was open.
I can't do you Archer, but I can do you Biggs. Yes. I thought you were going to tell me that Jeffrey Archer took the photograph. That would have been even more chaotic, wouldn't it?
Perhaps he did, anyone for a quick buck on that.
Absolutely. Talk us through then, what happened in 1965 then in Wandsworth? How did Ronnie Biggs escape that jail?
Okay, well, in 65, the view of prisoners then was not if you could escape, but when. There were a lot of people escaping in various methods because things weren't secure. But Wandsworth was an A-list prison there. It was considered one of the most secure. They had separated the train robbers around various prisons in Britain. And one that people are all forgetting is that on the 12th of August, 1964, Charlie Wilson was the first of the train robbers to escape. He escaped from Winson Green in Birmingham. Yeah. And that was a very and very complicated escape. Now, Ron's one in Wandsworth, and you can see the picture of the wall a second ago. He worked out that the only way to get out of Wandsworth was to go over the wall. He did have an offer of, believe it or not, somebody suggested taking a helicopter to get him off the exercise yard. Within Wandsworth, Ron was surprised that he, as a special watch prisoner, they did their exercise in the yard right next to the wall. And also, if you look at that wall, Ron needed to know the exact height of it. And as a builder, what he did was he counted the bricks. So he knew exactly how high the wall was. And he had, the prisoners in there were outraged that he had been given 30 years. And all of them were saying, we've got to get you out. You need to get out. Ron at first thought he would stay and be a good boy. But the way they were looking after him, because this escapes and other attempts from great train robbers, was like he was under supervision 24 hours per day. So he came up with this plan of Paul Seaborn, who was in with him at the time as a prisoner. When he was released, he organised to get a removal van, if you like, and bring it up to the wall at a specific time that they knew they would be doing exercise in the yard. And they had an hydraulic lift in the top of the van to take it to the height of the wall. And Paul threw over a rope ladder, which Ron and Eric Flower, who was inside with him, then went up the ladder and over the wall, jumped into the van. They had cars waiting for them to get in, and they sped off through London.
That's so easy. What was there as you're telling us this story, Christopher? I'm imagining, on the other side of the yard there was a prison officer going, "Oh my God," and then running, seeing Ronnie Biggs climbing up a ladder. Was it that, or did nobody notice for a bit?
Oh, they did. They did notice. It was Ron had paid off two guys in the prison to, if you like, rugby tackle the guards that were in the actual yard. We're very civilized in Britain. Nobody's in prisons has got guns, so nobody's going to up a watchtower going to shoot you going over the wall. Yeah. And so the two guys that only had truncheons, they were rugby tackled. And of course, you had everybody else exercising in the yard. Once they realized what was going on with the rope ladders dropping down, they all made sure they got in the way of the guards. So Ron and Eric Flower went up and over the wall. And in fact, two other guys took advantage of the moment and followed them up over it and went with them as well.
Yeah, well, you'd give it a go, I guess, wouldn't you? If that was your,
but what you can see from the photo there is still to this day. I mean, the houses on the right, they in 65 they were much more simple houses, and they were actually the warders lived in them. Yeah. Today it's a very sort of posh residential thing, but that's still the wall of the prison. And as you can see, some man's just parked his car there. I could walk round the wall.
It's quite extraordinary, that, isn't it? I guess they've got more CCTV and the like. And just very briefly, because we are short of time, Christopher, but I mean, this has been fascinating stuff. So Ronnie Biggs, off he goes. One would assume there was some sort of car chase immediately, but it didn't quite work out like that. He was, found himself able to breathe a sigh of relief rather quickly.
Yeah, I mean, he found out later that he assumed that you'd have a button that you press in prison and say somebody's escaped. But in 65, they had to ring 999 and inform the police that they'd lost Biggs. Ron's plan was very clever. I mean, the cars they had as a getaway actually then drove close to Wandsworth to a cul-de-sac where they got out the car and then ran down the cul-de-sac and had another car waiting. So if the police had been following them, they would have been stuck. They'd have been following them and they'd have been away. Yeah. But they never saw anybody. There was never anybody chasing them. But the interesting tip I'd give to the authorities about the current escape is how Ron kept the information coming and going was that Eric Flower was also on remand, or was waiting trial like this gentleman who's escaped, and therefore had access to his lawyer coming in every day. So that meant that's how information went in and out about Ron's escape and what was planned. Yeah. And I think they need to have a good look at who was coming in every day and being able to chat and take information out.
So just very briefly, just run us through the numbers then. How long he was sentenced in the early 60s? How long did he serve before escape?
He'd done a year and a bit.
Year and a bit. He disappears then for 36 years. My goodness. He then comes back. How long did he serve on his return?
Nearly about 10 years in the end.
About 10 years. So
and it was ridiculous. He was very ill before we got him out. I mean, he was on death's door when we got him out, and then he recovered. So.
I seem to remember some of those photographs well back then. Listen, very thorough stuff. Christopher, thank you, sir. Christopher Pickard, friend of the great train robber Ronnie Biggs. He wrote the book. Biggs escaped, of course, Wandsworth Prison back in... He was not a nice man, of course, in 1965, but the audaciousness and the ease with which he legged it, you look at that and think, wow, if I was in that position, I'd probably give it a go. And then he spent 36 years in Rio, having a rather wonderful life, and came back of his own volition.